Hello there, everyone, and welcome back to the Real Life Process Podcast. My name is Teresa McCloy, and I am thrilled to be with you and back recording podcasts again. I did several episodes ahead through the holiday season. It's now January the 4th, 2023, and it is great to be back with you on the podcast. One of the things back a few months ago when we recorded the 200th episode of our podcast, we've been doing this since 2019, and we started in January of 2019. One of the things that I said on the 200th episode is that we wanted to show up with you in the podcast around our core values, which are being real, being present, bringing joy, and creating impact. And we wanted the podcast episodes that we were doing, the content that we were bringing to you each and every week to reflect those things. So today's episode is not an easy one to record, but I think it's an important one to record as we do life together and as I do life with you in community through this platform. And today's episode, I want to talk with you about something I've been walking through now for the last 5.5 months. And I want to give you a little bit of the background of the story of this, and then how I'm processing it, how our community is processing it, because I think that's of great value, and then how you might process this in your own story. So on August the 9th of 2022, my dearest friend and one of our team members, Terri Johnson, was diagnosed with stage 4 lung cancer. And I was actually with her at that diagnosis. We were in the emergency room together because she had such severe back pain. And that was one of the most life-changing moments for me on that day. And impactful moments other than the loss of our son, Eric. And I talk about the loss of our son, Eric, in the book that I wrote and that was just released back on November 1st of last year. And if you've read that book or if you picked that book up, you'll hear me walk through that journey and what actually brought me to create the life process that we now teach and train people to do, and we walk with our personal clients through, called the Real Life Process. And in that story, throughout the threads of that story, is this dear friend of mine, Terri Johnson, walking that journey with me because of how our lives intersected between her son and her daughter and my son. And so she became one of my dearest friends back in 2012, and we've done 10 years together. And in August, our story changed, and it flipped drastically with her diagnosis. And the loss of Terri, she passed away on Christmas morning at 5:30 in the morning. I lost my dear friend. We lost a team member as Terri served on our team here at the Real Life Process. She had been a part of our team for about the past 18 months or so, actually on the team serving, coaching for us, serving as the integrator on our team, being in our community of facilitators, certified people that are going through the certification process. Just walking hand in hand with me. She's been a part of, as some of our other team members are, of creating what this process is. Because part of this process has been my story over the last 10 years to learn to live life from a place of rest, not rush. It's also been a part of Terri's journey and many others on our team. We've done this together. And that loss, even though on August 9th, when I was with her and received that diagnosis of cancer, and we knew that it was terminal, we knew that the real possibility, as the cancer was throughout her entire body, that it was a real possibility that her days on this earth would be very short. And they were only 5.5 months. And one thing that I was very aware of as the diagnosis came was how I wanted to walk beside her and how I wanted to become a spiritual companion for her. And that our friendship would shift and change, and that it wasn't about a give and take in a friendship anymore, but it was about leaning in with her to be present to her and to be present to her family that I know well. But another piece of this that became very apparent to me as well was how was our community going to process this together? So I want to be very real with you. I, as a leader and as someone who was leading these people in community together, we meet on a weekly basis. We're together on retreats and gatherings a couple of times a year. Many of us see us in person as we travel. We have a lot of relationship together. I need to really discern how we were going to navigate this diagnosis together and the upcoming loss probably of Terri together. And so that became a process of learning to process our grief in community. So I'd love to share with you a little bit on this episode, as I have experienced grief and loss in my life. I actually even did an episode about grief back in one of my early episodes when the podcast was based around the Enneagram and the tool of the Enneagram. It was episode number 35. And I recorded a podcast on grief through the lens of the Enneagram with some friends of mine, Kathleen and Scott Lowridge, and they had lost their son at a young age, and our son as well was only 30 when he passed away from drug addiction and an overdose. And so even as the book has come out, as Terri's diagnosis has come, as I just looked and reflected on my life, as Dale and I, my husband and I, dealt with infertility at a very young age, and that was a grief and a loss. I just recognized the thread in my story of loss and grief and how God has walked with me in those places and walked alongside of me. But yet there are stages to grief, as many of you know. And I don't have all the answers. I don't have all of the ways to deal with grief. I have a lot of resources and I've learned a lot. But this idea of processing grief in community with a virtual community as well was totally new to me. And I really feel like our community is doing it well. And I just want to walk through and just kind of talk honestly today on the podcast about how we've done that. One of our coaches, Erica Vinson, that also works on our team, quoted something that she had heard from one of her coaches. And I think it's a really great phrase of, we experience grief in community, but we process it solo. We process our grief alone, but being able to experience something that we can grieve together, whether it's the loss of a person, such as our experience with losing Terri from a very significant place in our community, in our virtual gathering and community, or it's the loss of, when we all walked through the COVID seasons of life. That was a grieving process for many of us. How do we do that in community well? Which I think is a deep part of building community, is both the joys and the sorrows. I think that's a reflection of a part of who we are as we all bring our different pieces. I love the tool of the Enneagram. And when I look through the lens of that tool and how we all grieve differently and we all bring things to the community, that are impactful to others. So when Terri passed away on Christmas Day, just a couple of weeks ago at 5:30 in the morning, and I needed to share that information with our community. I needed to pass that along to them. And I shared with them immediately when we did that announcement that we would gather together to honor her and to remember her. And so, actually, just last night, before I recorded this podcast episode, we did that. We gathered virtually over Zoom, all of those that were able to attend or wanted to attend, and came together to share story, to share laughter, to share lots of tears, to share the impact. We spent some time together in prayer. We spent some time together in responsive reading and other ways of engaging. And I heard from so many of our community members today that they didn't even know necessarily that they needed that time, but they did. And I think that's something to pay attention to. Is sometimes we don't even know what we need when we're walking in grief, when we're walking in loss. One of our facilitators shared with us by email that because this was someone only she knew, her family did not know this person, others did not know of her. She was holding the grief all in because it was her grief, even though they were being kind and they understood that she'd suffered a loss. They didn't know the person. They didn't know Terri the way she did. Terri had been a coach, a mentor, a friend over the last couple of years. And so I think that's important. And this is just my own reflection, but even as we think about how the world has opened up virtually, I can be on a call with one of our facilitators who's in the Bahamas or across the United States. And so when we learned of Terri's passing, I wanted to create as best a space as we could to be together. And so I just want you to consider and ponder that as you think about your own losses and different things that might come into your life of where do you want to be? Where do you want to show up in community? Who do you need to walk with you in community? And can you do the best that you can in even a virtual setting to reach out to someone, to be on a call with them face to face? Would that be better than the phone for you to be able to see one another? Last night, I was very, very grateful for a platform that we could be on together and be in community together face to face as best we could. It would have been better to be hugging one another and all of that, but it was the best that we could do to share together in community so that actually today we could be on our community call together and be able to show up well and begin moving forward in processing our own grief, that we could move into the space whole, that we could move into our community calls that we do each and every Wednesday morning in a different way. Is the loss still there? Is the grief still happening? Absolutely. Terri's services aren't even until this Saturday, and some of our community is traveling in. Many will not be able to, though. And so I'm just putting it out there, very real, very present with you of this is how we've done it. This is how we've experienced it. For the thought, because I've just thought about this a lot, there are so many virtual workspaces now, so many places where things like this could happen. The loss of a teammate, the loss of someone you work with, and how are you going to process that with your community and with your team? And then I want to talk a little bit on this particular episode too about grief, just in general, and the stages of grief that we go through. When I first found out about Terri's diagnosis, and many of you listening have probably experienced or walked with someone through a cancer diagnosis. had my sister-in-law have cancer in the past year. But we weren't sure at that point with her that it was a terminal. We knew immediately with Terri that we were going to be walking in that space. And so there are stages of grief, and some of those stages can begin to experience at all kinds of ways, even before the person may have passed, or stages of grief happen, as I said, when Dale and I walked through infertility. Those are stages of grief. The COVID experience is something many of us have felt. But I just want to briefly walk through the stages of grief and give you some practical, that's what I'm always about, practical ways that you might see it and notice it for yourself, and maybe even what it looks like and what it feels like in these different stages. You may want to download this free download that we have that's attached to this episode in the show notes, that will even give you this content I'm going to walk through in written form. So you can go back and look at it and say, wow, I didn't even recognize that for myself. Or I want to keep this a reference for a time that I might need it. Or maybe this is something that you many of you that listen to the podcast are in some type of helping profession. Well, you help others as a coach, a spiritual director, a mentor, you're in the ministry space, or, you're a leader of a team, and you're like, what does this look like for my team or my business as they walk through? So I'm just going to take you through this briefly and walk through it. And then if you'd like to download this resource, you're more than welcome to. So the 5 stages of grief are denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. Now, some research and things out there have 7 stages of grief and put some different, but for today's podcast and for this resource, I'm going to talk about these 5. Denial is kind of that first stage, and it really does help to protect us and becomes a defense mechanism. Sometimes right in that moment, fight, flight, and freeze kicks in, if you've heard those phrases. And we may really deny the fact that this is even happening or block the experience out. And it can look like things, it's a little bit sometimes mind numbing. The first few days, I've experienced that often in the last couple of weeks since Terri's passing, of, just mindless behavior. I remember a few days ago, actually just cleaned out all my office drawers, which isn't a negative behavior, but it was just like I couldn't think about anything in deep ways. So mindless behavior, keeping yourself busy. It could look like procrastination or forgetting. You might even be saying to everybody, I'm fine. People are asking me how I'm doing, and I'm like, I'm fine. That's a little bit of denial. It can feel like, here at the Real Life Process, we use feeling charts, and we love really naming feeling words. And what's funny is I learned a lot of that from Terri, my friend, because as she processed her life story and her life, and had been in recovery for over 10 years, she had to learn to use feeling words. So she would often call me out and say, tell me how it feels. Not, well, it feels like, but tell me how it really feels. So as I share these stages, I'll share with you some things that are feeling. Might feel like shock, confusion, you're shutting down, you're numb. Those are some feelings that it might feel like. So that first stage is denial. It's usually happening, in those first few days after something that you're needing to grieve, maybe even the first few weeks. And then it could quickly turn to the next stage of grief, which can be anger. You may feel an intense anger, vengeful thoughts. It can be directed at you. It could even be directed at an object or the person that you've lost, or even at God. And it can look like cynicism, sarcasm, irritability, getting into arguments, and you're not even sure why you're arguing with someone. And it can feel like frustration, impatient, resentment, rage, out of control. And as you move through these stages, there is kind of this natural progression. And so the anger stage is, somewhere you want to pay attention to and begin, to continue to work through that and process it and write about it. And all of these stages, writing, experiencing community, processing solo, experience community, reaching out, whether that's to a coach, to a spiritual director, to a therapist or a counselor or a pastor as you walk in these stages. Another stage that you might experience is the bargaining stage. And this is kind of that place where you almost want to avoid the inevitable, that yes, you've experienced this steep loss and you kind of want to make promises to avoid the pain or the loss. You might ruminate in the past, overthink or worry, predict the future, but yet assume the worst because you've just experienced a deep loss. Perfectionism. You might get into the pattern of, I probably should have, or if only I would have, or you're judging others or yourself about even where you're at. It can feel like, and these are hard feelings in this stage of grief, guilt or shame or blame, fear, anxiety, insecurity, because you are trying to move on, but you haven't quite got there yet, so you're trying to bargain. And you're also learning to live in a different place without a person in this stage of the grief that you're processing around the loss of a person, a friend, a family member. I know for me, just in this last week, I've experienced a few places as I've gotten back into routine after the Christmas holiday. I really had the blessing last week of a very quiet week where I could do a lot of processing about the loss of my friend. But then this week I stepped back into my work world, and Terri was a part of my work world up until 5 months ago, and a part of my routines and my behaviors and my rhythms, which is something we talk about a lot at the process, is behaviors, rhythms, and routines, and creating those positive parts of living in your best life and how you make those decisions. So a lot of my process of my everyday ordinary life involved Terri. So I've really noticed, like when I get in the car to drive home, many times I would call and process parts of the day with her. Over the last 5 months, it's been processing how her day was, not mine. And there are just places where, when you get back into a routine after a loss, it can feel, you can feel that guilt and that shame of like you're moving on without someone. And that often can lead to another stage of grief, which is a hard stage that we call depression. This is where the sadness and the guilt and the despair can really become evident. You can feel that helplessness or hopelessness or overwhelm. You have difficulty sleeping or eating. Reduced energy, social involvement, motivation, crying, again, maybe substance abuse. If you have a tendency to over abuse anything, eating, drugs, alcohol, that might want to kick in. So again, getting in community and being in community in some way, shape, or form, or reaching out to process these feelings, because it can look like hopelessness and disappointment and overwhelm and sadness. And as you move through these stages and cycle through, it is having the support that you need. And I was so grateful last night when we got on together in community to have a community to reach through. So whether that's a virtual community or an in-person community, where can you reach out to when you're walking in these stages of grief? And then the very last stage that we move towards, and this could take, there's no timeline for these stages. They could take weeks, they could take months, depending on the depth of relationship and the loss. The final stage is where an individual, where a person, where you're able to accept the reality of the situation. One of the most beautiful parts of Terri's story is how quickly she accepted her reality. As someone that she had a counseling background, and she knew to reach out and do grief counseling around her own end of life experience. And her acceptance and the beauty and the grace that she walked the 5.5 months of her process really is such a gift to all of us who knew her. And all of us, we talked about it last night in community. And where she was able to accept helps us in being able to accept the reality of the situation. She did a beautiful podcast that I want to reference and we'll put in the show notes with one of our facilitators, Chris Hines. And we will link to that podcast if you'd like to meet Terri, if you'd like to hear her voice and hear the episode that Chris did with her. It is just a beautiful episode. And she recorded that just a few months ago with him on this experience of her diagnosis and walking in that. And you hear her faith and her beautiful faith journey. Because in this stage, hope starts to emerge and you begin to find peace and begin to see some forward movement in your life. It can look like beginning to engage in reality again, and coming to that place of acceptance of today. This is how it is today. Being able to be vulnerable and welcome your emotions. Welcome the tears, the laughter, the joy, letting go of some of the defensiveness, being able to communicate honestly and have coping skills. So it can feel like things like something is good. It's courageous. You're having self-compassion. You're regaining some of your energy and your pride and your wisdom. And as I said, watching Terri walk through even these stages of her grief for her own life in the past 5 months has been a beautiful thing as we saw her move to that word of acceptance and her peace because of her faith and because of what she knew and what she believed, was able to live into that acceptance. It was just a beautiful thing to watch. But I am so grateful for how we were able to process together in community and walk this journey with her in our real life process community. We also, another community and space, and many of you know, and you've heard me talk about working out of a co-working space. And Terri was a part of this co-working space, and she was here, as my other team members are as well, off and on. And just how she was able to lean into community and draw from, whether it be our community, the co-working space community, the community of her family and friends. She welcomed everyone who wanted to come and see her and wanted to be with her. And it was just such a beautiful thing to see her holding space with us as we were walking with her. I know this has been a different kind of podcast and episode, but I just wanted to show up real and present so that I could talk about my story. I think story matters so much as we lean into knowing our real self and then living that out in our real lives so that we can do the work that we're called to do in this season. And that's what we do here at the Real Life Process. This is who we are. We show up real and present. Bring joy means so much more to me even now, because that was something Terri brought. She had this great laughter and joy. And then the impact that her life created, the lives of our facilitators as they're creating impact with their clients, the lives that you are having impact on as well. One of the things, and I'll kind of close and wrap up this podcast episode with this, one of the things that Terri and I talked about when we left ER that day. And the doctor had shared with her diagnosis. And it was very evident to him just from a CT scan that he had given her that she had cancer in multiple places in her body, but mostly in her spine and her back, coming from her lung. So it spread to many places. And we just sat in the car in the parking lot afterwards. And, you know, as someone who had walked in recovery and knew all the tools of recovery and had worked as a recovery counselor for several years before she joined our team, I shared with her, she said, I'm not sure I know what to do. And I said, you're going to do what you've always done, which is live every day present to today. She had those tools. God had prepared her with those tools. And that's what she did. She really lived into every single day and every moment that she had from the day of her diagnosis, and did the things that she wanted to do in those last 5.5 months with the people. And there were two things. She said, I want to eat good food and I want to be with my people. And it just speaks to the value of relational depth and community. So if you experience grief this year, I just pray for you in that, and I just hold space with you in that. If you have experienced grief and loss, like our community has, like I have personally, like our team has, like Terri's family has, reach out, find some community people, some support that you can be in to even walk through these stages and recognize them and say, this is part of the process of me coming to a place of wholeness again without this person in my life. We love our community. We love our facilitators. We love how they're showing up in the world with people as coaches, as directors, as mentors, as ministers. And they are many times, people are coming to them and coming maybe to you as you're in this space as well, with loss and with great loss. And I hope that this has been helpful to just hear of these stages, to process them yourself, to really think about, what do I need right now? Is there something I'm still grieving? A loss of relationship, a loss of a person physically from this earth? Is there something that I see that I need to process out loud in community and experience it in community so I can process it alone, solo? So different kind of podcast today. I hope it's helpful. I hope you can lean in. We just wish blessings on your year in 2023. Yes, we know, my team knows, I know that we have some things to continue to process in our own grief. So that's why I wanted to share it with you, my listeners, so that you would just know where we're at and what's going on with us. We have some amazing, exciting things to share with you about the real life process, not only with the book that just came out a couple months ago, but with some other things that are coming your way here in 2023, that are coming our way, that are more tools and more things that can help you process things like grief and really live life to the fullest and richest. That's what Terri did. That's what we talked about that day in the parking lot, is that every ordinary day has an extraordinary moment. You just have to look for them. That's what she did. And I want to continue to honor that with you, even in community, right here on this podcast. So we'll be back next week with more. Thank you for letting me process with you in community.